Hey folks, so we are on the next lecture on Bootstrap, which covers forms in Bootstrap. Um, if you've used the internet, if you've used a web page on the internet more specifically, in the last decade, you've used a form. Forms are just part of websites. You're not going to come across a modern website where you don't have a form. There's always a reason for gathering information from your end user. What's your name? Who are your customers' names? What's their email address? Marketing campaigns for mailing lists, uh, purchase something on a form, search for something on a form. I cannot think of, I'm sure there is an example, but most websites have forms on them. Most websites need to be mobile responsive. 2021, this is just common stuff, right? So to say, okay, let's learn how to do forms and let's learn how to make forms mobile responsive, pretty critical stuff, right? Because again, your websites will more than likely have forms on them and they will more than likely need to respond responsively. Okay, so when it comes to forms in Bootstrap, it's just like everything else in Bootstrap. How do you do anything in Bootstrap? You add a class. You add many classes. And so forms are the same way. The main thing that the Bootstrap classes do is they customize their displays for consistent rendering across browsers and devices. Now, yesterday, you guys all did a lab where you just did a standard HTML5 form. Okay? And you might have noticed this, you might not have noticed that, but if you just open that form in different browsers, regular HTML5 forms don't look the same cross browsers. Many different browsers render forms differently. Okay, so that's a problem, so to speak, out of the box that Bootstrap solves. Cross-browser forms. You don't get that out of the box with HTML5, so that's great. Consistent look. Okay, I would also argue a more modern look for your forms. If you look at the forms as they were in your homework, they probably look like something out of the 90s, right? They don't exactly look modern. And that's, again, what Bootstrap helps us solve. More modern looking forms and cross-browser compatibility. What we learned yesterday is that the input tag is used for a lot of form controls. Okay, web forms have what are called controls. These are your radio buttons and your checkboxes and your drop-down lists and your text areas and your text boxes and your select lists, right? Your lists. So those are all called controls, and controls all go into your forms. The input tag can render a lot of those controls. So the input tag's like your one tag. Like if there's a most important tag, you could argue it's the input tag because the input tag is used for so much. And in Bootstrap, all of those input tags are still relevant. We're still going to use those input tags. We're just going to add classes to them. So input type of date, right? We still want to use input type of date. We still want to use input type of radio. All these input tags, we still want to use the type attribute on our input tags, email addresses, numbers for numbers, so on and so forth, to take advantage of, again, the cross-browser display and more modern-looking display. The first class that we want to learn and get familiar with is the form control class. And so if there's a control like a textual control like inputs and text areas, okay, we're going to add the class of form control. There's also a class of form label to the label elements. And so very commonly yesterday, that's what we were doing. We talked about having a label that would say first name and then associating that label with a text box so that you could like even click on the label and it would focus the text box, right? And so these are the basic classes for some of our basic controls like inputs and text areas, form controls and form labels. I also put a little bullet on here. One of my favorite things about forms in Bootstrap is the validation. It's important to define what I'm talking about with validation. Validation is when a user fills out your form and they forget to fill out a field and they click submit. Validation is the process that says, hey, this is a required field. Don't submit the form, right? So it's input validation is what when I'm talking about validation, the input being the information that the end user is inputting into your website, right? So one of the neatest features to me is how validation works in Bootstrap. And I'll do a little demonstration of validation here at the end. So here's an example of working with some form controls. And I've just highlighted what the classes that I put on the previous slide. Okay, and let's see if I can zoom in here. There we go. That's a little bit easier to see, right? So what's different here from what we did yesterday? Let's see. Yesterday we were using the label tag and then we would have email address. Now, yesterday we learned a couple different approaches of associating a label with an input control. One approach is you would have the label and you'd have the for attribute. Now you notice the for attributes as example form control input 1, and that matches the ID of this input control here. Okay, so from the markup point of view, there's a couple of ways of linking a label to a text box. And this is one common approach. The for attribute, the value here matches the ID of the input control. Okay. Now, what does that actually do? Like, what's the importance of linking those two things together? DJ? That's right. So it's an accessibility feature, right? And so the idea here is that someone who might be using the mouse that might have a shaky hand, right, has a hard time using the mouse. If they click on accident, if they click the text email address, because that's where they're trying to click here is this text box, it will focus the text box that's linked up with the label. Okay, so it's really just an accessibility feature. It's a nice feature. You should do it. That's one way of doing it. That's not new. What's new today is the class of form label and the class of form control. What do we get by adding these classes? Well, we get a more modern looking control that's cross-browser compatible. And it does have some responsive nature because it's Bootstrap. It's going to respond. In that manner. So let's just real quick. I could just code this up real quick. If I go to labs, let's just say this is chapter 13 lab. This is So if I go to getbootstrap.com, getting started, right, we'll just copy our starter template. And the first thing I'm going to do here is add a form tag. One rule to remember, all controls must go in a form tag. Okay, you typically have only one form per page. There's an action attribute that's important here. We'll leave that. We kind of talk about what the action attribute does. Of course, that's going to be on, you know, the written test and all that kind of stuff. The action attribute points you at a server-side script. We talk about generating server-side scripts. That's your third semester. You know, if you're writing JavaScript, you can make JavaScript go server-side or client-side. Okay, but you might say do something.js. And the idea is that this would be a server-side script. Because JavaScript can go either way, client-side or server-side. HTML, client-side. CSS, client-side. JavaScript, either way. Okay, there's also a method attribute. Remember, this has to do with how data is sent to the server. Which one was more secure, get or post? Post. Okay, so we talked about all of that yesterday, so that's all good stuff. Now, all we're going to do is add a label control. You'll notice that it auto-populates something for, I'll just say first name. I'll have an input control, input type of text. ID is first name. The label will say first name. And let's add the classes. All we're doing here is adding Bootstrap classes. Before we add the classes, let's just glance at it. Very basic, first name. Let's just see what it looks like when we add the classes. Okay, again, the classes are form-label and form-control. So class of form-label, class of form-control. Okay, so, well, first off, it worked. You see what it does. Our text box is now responsive in nature. It's 100% of the container that it's in. And that would be cross-browser, right? So now those are the features that we're getting. You know, I don't want that to go 100% width. How do I fix that? Well, there's a bunch of solutions. Probably, well, you're familiar with the grid system, so you could put it in a grid. We'll talk about how to put it in a grid. There's Flexbox. You could put it in a Flexbox. You could put it in a card. Cards are really specifically for things, not forms. When I say things, products. Think of things out of a database. Like that's the purpose of a card. A card is say, okay, you know, here's your users that came out of the database. Here's your products that came out of the database. Those are what cards are really useful for things, right? Could you put it in a card? Yeah. But cards don't exist for positioning purposes. That's not the purpose of a card. The grid system is for positioning. Right, so what do we have left in here? Well, the only thing that's on this slide, they have the placeholder, name@example.com. So that's on our here, placeholder attribute, something@me.com. You can see that's kind of like there's a difference between placeholder text and value. You see placeholder, what it does? It's just grayed out and behind the text box. And as I start to type, it disappears. Right? So placeholder text is demonstrating to the end user the format that you're looking for. Placeholder text is great and very useful because a lot of end users, how many different ways can you write a birthday, right? There's all these different ways to format a date. There's all these different ways to format your first name. Do you want my first name capitalized? Do you not want it capitalized? How do you want it, right? So placeholder text, very useful. The difference between placeholder and value is an actual text value that you can delete, right? So when you refresh the page, if this were to be submitted to the server, that value would be recorded whatever is in that text box. So that is an actual piece of text that's in the text box. Placeholder versus value, right? So those two attributes are different in that way, and that's worth pointing out. I put this slide in here because when it comes to accessibility, you see this a fair amount, these ARIA attributes. And basically that's going to help with your screen readers. Okay, it's going to help the screen readers. In this example, this ARIA described by. So this, what is this? This is an email input. And it says, hey, there's a description for this in the tag that has the ID of email help. So if you kind of go to email help here, there's a little piece of text that the screen reader would read. We'll never share your email with anyone else. And so that would be read by the screen reader when referring to the email input box. And so there's a little descriptor there. Form text should be explicitly associated with the form control it relates to by using the ARIA described by attribute. This will ensure that assistive technology such as screen readers will announce this form text when the user focuses or enters the control. Let's just talk about accessibility for one more second. Tim Berners-Lee, right? I've said this before. Tim Berners-Lee says that one of the objectives of the World Wide Web should be that all content should be accessible. So as web developers, we should learn. It's a learning process. As we become better developers, we should learn better ways to make our content accessible to everybody, regardless of disability. Okay, we've talked about the different kinds of disability that there are. There's many kinds of disabilities that can inhibit people from using their site. By law, government websites must be made accessible. So when we learn a tip like this, when we learn how to make our forms more accessible, is it a best practice to make your forms accessible? Yes. And you should do so as you become better developers. You should make your content as accessible as possible. Where it becomes law, where it becomes a requirement of the job, is when you work for the government. Or you work on a website that the government interfaces with. For example, Rankin.edu. Rankin.edu works with the government how? Well, our students take government financial aid. So we interact with the government. Therefore, a certain level of accessibility must be met on our website because we interact with government agencies. And so accessibility is something you should learn for your own personal development, to be a better developer, to make your websites more accessible. But in many cases, it's law. And there's levels of accessibility. Okay. You can also make your controls larger or smaller. So you kind of have a default input, and we can add this class of form control large or form control small. This is just a simple class to add. So here's our form control. Again, to add multiple classes, we just add a space. right? So right now our input has one class. To add multiple classes, and you've done this, button primary, button large, right? You've got one anchor tag that's a button, and you add 3 classes to it. And so now we're going to add the class of form-control-lg, form-control-lg, and that makes this just a little bit bigger, right? SM is our other one, makes it a little bit smaller. Okay, they make it a little bit easier to make it bigger or smaller. That's nice. That's nice. What else can you say? That's nice. Another control that we learned about besides our, by the way, form type of text, form type of email, right? It can be email, right? Input type of date. Nice little formatting date calendar. Cannot tell you how awesome that is. Just by changing the input type to date, right? We get all this little functionality out of a control with today's date selected, holidays, leap years. I mean, all this stuff accounted for, days of the week. I will tell you, I've coded a little calendar like this, a little JavaScript calendar, because that's what would be required. 10 pages, if you will, 10 a lot of lines of JavaScript to create this. Took a lot of code to make a little calendar like that. So yeah.
Is that an HTML or is that with Bootstrap?
So it's with both. The question is that a Bootstrap feature or is that an HTML5 feature? The input type of date is built into HTML5. It's made better with Bootstrap, right? The date control, again, is uniform across browsers, right? It works because these HTML5 attributes were not there. What other type attributes did we cover in that lecture yesterday? You guys remember any others? Password. This is my favorite one. Right? Did I show in the video the little how to cheat that? I did. Did I go on Twitter on the video? Did I go on Twitter?
Right. You didn't pull up your screen, so I just heard.
Oh, come on. That was the best example. This is like my favorite thing. Remember how I said HTML, CSS is front-end code? What does that mean, front-end code? What do I mean by that?
What the user sees.
It's what the user sees. DJ? What you're looking at. It also means that, remember I talked about the rendering engine? The rendering engine that's built into the browser. And so what does that rendering engine do? The rendering engine does the work of interpreting your code and drawing the screen. That's what the rendering engine does. But where does the rendering engine run? It runs on your laptop. So when I say client-side code, your laptop is the client. And so the processing, the work is done on the client. Okay, so if there's work to be done and you do it on the client side, that's one thing. If work needs to be done, it could also be done on the server side. Server side work is another way that code could be processed. So code is either run on the client or code is run on the server. Inherently, client-side code is less secure because people can change it. You have access to the HTML and I can change it. Let me go on my actual, let's see, I think if I log in here to my Twitter, You know, I don't really use Twitter all that much. Let me see if I can log in right quick. Give me 1 second to look up my password and credentials. Put a little Jeopardy theme music on for me. And okay, let's see. Username, password. Okay. My profile picture is like at least 15 years old. Okay. So you guys can see some of the stuff that I follow, news and business and baseball and whatever. Okay. One of my favorite things to do, and I do this. I do this example regardless of who the president is. I don't care if they're left or they're right. I always make fun of the president. So I don't care your political preferences. Our president today happens to be Joe Biden, and okay, so this is a very political hot topic. So don't get offended. Biden's vaccine mandate for workers is supported by, uh, you know, legal precedents. Experts say so. You know, so this is for governmental workers, right? So they're going to do some vaccine mandates for government workers. You can never believe what you see on the internet because it's very easily manipulated. And I show you how insecure front end code is. I could come right into here. Actually, that's okay. So let's actually go to President Biden's here. Okay, so let's just pretend that I wanted to mess with Joe Biden. I can inspect the code. And so right here it says, from healthcare to childcare, my Build Back Better agenda will lower everyday costs for middle-class Americans. And let's just say that I didn't like Joe Biden and I wanted to change what he said. I can come right into the HTML, and here's where I can see the actual text. And I'm going to change the word lower to raise everyday costs, right? So Joe Biden just now tweeted from healthcare to childhood, my Build Back Better will raise everyday costs for middle class Americans. And so he accidentally screwed up that one keyword, and I'll go to my snipping tool and take a quick snip, and I'll share this on. So I'll take a quick snip of President Biden talking about raising on Twitter the cost of everyday costs, and then I'll go onto my Facebook and I'll tweet that out and get all of my right-leaning Republican friends to retweet, and boom, misinformation has been born and spread. And anyway, the point is, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to post misinformation on the internet when HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because they're rendered on the client side, I can change any part of this. I could come into here, into President Joe Biden, and I can make his font family, fuchsia if I wanted. If I want to make it, if I wanted to make it a girly looking name, President Joe Biden, I can change the HTML, I can change the CSS, and I can change the JavaScript. All through client-side code. Now, when you refresh the page, you'll see this is not a permanent change. It goes back to this is only a change on your end, but the point is you can intercept the code and change what it looks like on your end. Okay, so that's kind of a fun thing. Kind of getting back to where this all started with the password, right? So now that I'm logged in, if I log myself out, and if I go back to sign in here, if you ever forget your password, this is a really great tool. says, sorry, we can't find your account. There it is. This is our password text box, right? So how many times do you have your password cached and it tells you, you know, you need to change it, and you go, what is my password? I don't remember. It's typed in there, but I can't tell what it is, right? Right-click the text box and inspect. That brings us to the div. Here's our input. Notice the input type is password. If I go into this type attribute and I change the input type to text, very clearly see the password.
So if it auto completes your password and you type in text, it'll show you what it auto completed.
It shows you what it auto completed. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. How many times do you, you just change the word password, and because it's client side, it'll render the new control, and guess what? There it's in clear text. Right? Like, that would have been useful, you know. You know. I always wanted to know my girlfriend's password. No. It's on the input control, yep.
You have to change the word password.
Yep. Okay, so the reason I do all that example is this is not secure, okay? And I just wanted to point that out. By doing input type of password, it's good to a point. And that point is for someone who doesn't know HTML, right? If you know HTML, you know now how to circumvent the type attribute of password. What other types are there? What other types are there?
Number.
Type of number, right? And I still have my placeholder text, but the idea is it should accept, I cannot type a letter. Here I'm typing letters. It's not allowing it, it's only allowing numbers. Any others?
Radio.
Okay, radio. Now, save. Now, the classes are going to change for radio, so let's hold off on radio. But you're right. Let's pull up the slideshow and make sure that we're covering all the input types. So I pulled up the PowerPoint just for a few other. I can't say that I see this one all that often, but input type of color. You know, in the old days when you allowed end users to customize their colors, like on MySpace kind of thing, inside ranking, if you wanted to change the color scheme on inside ranking, we used to let students do that. We used to let our students customize their homepage. You could choose the input, the color scheme that you wanted. Let's just change that input type of color. Again, not that you see this one all that often. Right? You kind of get this color picker built in. So, intriguing. Let's see what else is in this slideshow. Make sure. Input type of search. Ooh, that's a good one. I like search. There is a built-in search. And let's get rid of the placeholder that says something. Let's say search box. And the value. I gotta get rid of the value. And this actually goes into your browser settings where it's like, what have you searched for before, right? Past searches. Apparently I searched for me@me.com at one point. So input type of search. Okay. Let's make sure there's nothing else worth.
Submit, reset.
Good. So input type of submit, input type of reset. Those are buttons. What's interesting about input type of submit input type input submit. Okay. So we get a submit button, but you can also do button type of submit. And then value says click me. Click me. It's not value then, is it? Button types of submit and input type of submit do the same thing. They submit your form to the client's to the server side script. So when you're looking at which one do you use, a recommendation that I have is actually using the button tag instead. The reason being is that it's more semantic, like it is a button. So instead of an input, which is allowing a user to type something in or provide you information, the button tag is the more semantic tag for submit buttons, right? So when you're choosing between input type of submit and button type of submit, go ahead and choose button type of submit. There's also input type of button. So there's input type of button. There's input type of submit, and there's reset. Okay, same thing for button. On buttons, there's button type of button. There's button type of button has no default behavior. It's just a button. You can click it, and when you click it, you get to program its response. So it has no default response. So a lot of the JavaScript that you write will respond to button clicks, button type of button. Then there's reset, button type submit. That's what you do. You just throw it in the. Had a brain fart there. Class, BTN, BTN success, BTN large. Right? So that would be the preferred way to do a submit button. It's semantic.
What is the, so if you're saying to use the button
Yep.
tag.
Yep.
What's the difference in the input that you
What's the difference between input and button? Not a thing. Functionally, they're exactly the same. Okay, one's more semantic than the other. That's the end of the differences. You can do image buttons, but you can do the same thing with buttons.
Oh, you can?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so here's a bunch of others. Input type of date time. Let's just do that. Input type of date time. That didn't have any sort of Bootstrap. Didn't change anything. Input type of month. Let's try input type of month. Oh, that's neat. You could choose input type of month. You can choose the month.
And that's input date,
That's input type of month.
input type of month.
Input type of, let's just see input type of week. Let's see how that responds. Allows you to select the week. That's nice. Oh, the week of the year. So this is the 17th week of the year.
That's kind of messed up. There's like one goes lower.
Well,
Oh, I see what it's doing. Never mind.
yeah, yeah. The weeks begin on Monday through Sunday. Let's do input type of time. Get a little icon here. A lot of times these are important pieces of information, dates and times. When did you register to become a user? When were you born? As infinite examples. Close, close, close. The HTML button. Close, close, close. Okay, so let's see. Do we cover all of those? Good. We did the input type of number, input type of submit. We did all those. Email address. Thing about email addresses, it kind of has some built-in validation. When we cover validation, we'll see a little bit of that. Input type of email is going to make sure something looks like an email address. Okay, now is it going to make sure that that email address is your email address? No, that's why you have to send the confirmation email. Okay, and there's a process to validate that, but your email address is going to give you something formatted like an email address. Website will be something formatted like a website, something at something.com or .net, so on and so forth. Something formatted like a phone number, right? Input type of tel, input type of URL, input type of email. So it's going to force some validation to give you something like one of those things. Okay, and then now we're just digging into the lecture a little bit. The next class is the form select class that belongs on a select list. And so the idea behind this, and I know I talked about this in the lecture yesterday, a select list, you provide the user with a bunch of options and it collapses. And so that's a nice part, is like, hey, pick your state. You got to show them 50 states and just let them pick from the list, right? So you're not allowing the end user to type in their state. And it doesn't take up a lot of space on the screen. So a select list will condense down. And so if we kind of go ahead and code a select tag, and then we'll say option one, 2, and 3. The class is form select. Okay, and that's how you get the Bootstrap enabled select list. Okay, so pretty straightforward on how to code that just by adding the class. You can add form select large, form select small to increase the size. So form select large, form select typo LG, make it a little bit bigger. Okay, we're going to go ahead and pause here for a minute. All right, we'll go ahead and resume. We left off on check boxes and radio buttons. And, so if you do the input type of radio, we even did this. Here's our input. And you have the wrong classes. Like this didn't work. Right, so just doing the input type of radio, you got to get the right classes. And so little bullet here that says the browser default checkboxes and radios are replaced with the help of the class of form check. So you notice that besides the form check input, there is a class called form check. So the form check class and form check input, a series of classes for both inputs that improve the layout and behavioral of their behavioral aspects of their HTML elements that provide greater customization and cross-browser consistency. So point being is that there's a parent that says, okay, we're going to have either some checkboxes or some radio buttons. So we have to add this parent called form check. So let's go back to our code and let's change this back. Div class form check, input type of checkbox, class of form check, and then it's form hyphen check hyphen input. Now let's go ahead and associate a label with that. So we'll give this an ID, yes or no, or we'll just say ID of yes. Label for yes, yes, so it'll just be a checkbox that says yes. Okay, and there's our Bootstrap checkbox. I mean, these are basic things, but that's how you code it. I said this in the lecture yesterday, you know, if you want to provide the user multiple options, then you use a checkbox. You know, select your favorite magazines that you want to subscribe to. You know, they can select multiple. Versus like something like gender, where you could say, okay, if you're male, then you're not female, kind of thing. You check one, you uncheck the other. Okay, so, and if you want to, and I know that there's a societal debate that says, well, you know, gender, you know, you could be non-binary. So maybe that's your third option, right? Male, female, non-binary. Okay, so we're taking that into account. So there's your check boxes. Of course, if we do input type of radio, class of form check input. The thing about radio buttons is by giving them the same name, you make them into groups. And so we'll just say the gender, right? So label for male, and we'll give this an ID of male. So here's our radio buttons for male and female. And again, to be up with the times in 2021, ID of non-binary. So here's our radio buttons, noticing when we check one, we uncheck the other. Obviously, whereas the check boxes, you could say your favorite browser, i.e. Internet Explorer, versus your favorite, you could say favorite browsers. Obviously, you can select multiple. There's radio buttons you can't. Okay. Key takeaways. What are your classes? You need a parent called form check, and then the children have the form check input and then form check label. Don't forget your form check label class form check label on your labels. So on and so forth. Let's see, group checkboxes or radios in the same horizontal row by adding the form check inline to any form check. So let's do that. So here's form check. Let's do form check inline. And actually, they were already going inline, aren't they? They were. Form check block does not work. Just tried that. Oh, in the example, each item is put in each. If you guys are following along, this code demonstration isn't tabbed very well because you'll notice this div ends right here. So the parent surrounds a single radio button. Then we open up another form check and it surrounds right here the second radio button. So each radio button has a div around it. Divs are block level elements causing line breaks, so they would not be inline by default if you have their divs that surround them like this. So in this example, these radio buttons would be stacked because they have divs around them. That's the difference between the slideshow and what I coded. I didn't put, which I should have. Each radio button should have its individual div class of form check around it. Something that I thought was interesting, so I put it in the slideshow. Checkboxes, are just yes or no inputs. If it's checked, it's a yes. If it's unchecked, it's a no. But Bootstrap has what are called switches, and they're just ways that'll take a checkbox instead of having a little check there. It'll obviously just be switched to an on-looking switch, and then if you click it again, it'll switch to an off-looking switch. And so I just thought that was kind of a new little control that's not been around forever. So I put that in there. You put the class of form switch on the form check parent, and that'll render that checkbox. Otherwise, it's just a checkbox, right? So input type of checkbox. So that's your switch. When it comes to layout, we mentioned this earlier, that you could use Flexbox, you could use the grid. In the first example on the documentation, you could just modify your layout by working with the white space, the margin, and the padding. And so they recommend, in this case, just adding some margin bottom to each of your group of controls. You can see here, they're adding margin to the bottom of this label and this input, as well as this one. So if you add margin to the bottom of each one, you just have a consistent way of adding margin to each control. However, you can use the grid. And so if you think of the grid system within Flexbox, the grid system works with rows and columns. And so here's our parent class of div class of row, div class of call. If you remember, your columns add up to 12, but if you don't specify a number, they evenly justify the space, the 12 columns. So you just calculate, okay, you got 2 columns, 12 spaces, so you're going to do 6 and 6. All right, so in this example, first name, last name go into a row, 6 and 6, and it's going to be responsive. So here's another example with the output. So email and password are going to be in the same row. So our parent class is the row, and you could apply the row to the form. So on the form, we had a row, and G of 3, remember that's our gutters. G of 3 talks about the padding between these two controls, the gutter between these controls. And we could see inside of our first row, we got call medium 6, call medium 6. Of course, that's going to be adding up to 12 on medium devices and up. So medium, large, extra large are going to have 2 columns. Small and extra small then would be 1 column, since we haven't specified anything smaller than that. Right, so our first row has 2, and then our next row has a div class of 12, which is our text box for our address. Right? So it's really just marrying the 2 concepts together. Right? So what's the key takeaway? You apply the class of row to the form, and then you have columns on the inside. Inside of your columns, you just put your controls. And so if you understand how the grid works, you understand how controls work in Bootstrap, you just put the 2 concepts together. Last demonstration, and then the PowerPoint is over. This is one of my favorite features about forms when it comes to Bootstrap is validation. Built into HTML5, you get some validation, but it's not very cross-browser efficient. Like, it doesn't work very well cross-browser. Different browsers give you different validation looks, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. So the HTML5 validation that you learn about in the book, it's good, it's just not great. Then there's also JavaScript validation. We will learn custom validation with JavaScript. It's important to learn how to do client-side validation with JavaScript. Okay? In the next 40 days, that's what we will be learning, is JavaScript, and how to do, part of that will be how to do validation with JavaScript. But there's a lot of validation that Bootstrap offers, form validation, that is cross-browser compatible, and it's pretty, I guess I would say, powerful right out of the box. You get a lot of benefits. So the classes that we talk about, the pseudo classes, are the invalid and the valid. And so these pseudo classes. Remember, pseudo classes, we talk about states. You know, the state of a control. Whether a control is considered to be a valid control, meaning the input is valid, or invalid control, meaning they didn't give us the right data. And so our controls can be in one of these 2 states. And so when the user clicks submit, you know, these controls will be put into an invalid or valid state. And you can customize how these pseudo classes look. Just like on our anchor tags, you can customize the a:\link. You can customize input : valid or input : invalid. And you can handle what these invalid controls look like. Okay, but luckily, Bootstrap does a lot of that for us. All right, another thing. So that's one thing to keep in mind. These pseudo classes for our input controls, invalid and valid. Another thing to keep in mind, for custom validation, this is that 3rd bullet, I skipped the 2nd bullet. For custom Bootstrap validation, you'll need to add some JavaScript. Well, actually, it says you need to add no validate Boolean attribute to your form. Okay, you'll see that. The second bullet says you need to add JavaScript for disabling your form submissions if there are valid fields. So I did that out of order and that was probably confusing. So let's look at this again. To do this validation, there's a little bit of JavaScript to copy and paste. That's what the second bullet says. To do this custom validation, there's an attribute that you'll add to the form that says no validate. It's a Boolean attribute, so it just says no validate on the form. All right. So here's the JavaScript that you'll copy and paste. I'll show you where that's at on the docs. I'll show you how to add this. So you'll add the following JavaScript just above the closing body tag. In order to get this Bootstrap validation to work, you got to copy and paste this. So let's go to getbootstrap.com. I'll do this demonstration. I'll slow down so that you can ask questions. Under the forms, there is validation. So you expand forms, you click on validation. A little bit more detail here than what I provided on the slide. As you scroll down, you see a bunch of markup. That markup is for this form right here. But let's just go down to the JavaScript. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this JavaScript.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where to move it to.
Click on Docs, expand forms, then click on validation.
Click on validation.
Correct. And you scroll down past the markup, and there's your JavaScript.
Is it on customize or is it on getting started?
So it's under forms.
So on my page, let's just pretend I want to do some validation here. I'm going to scroll to the bottom of my HTML, right above the closing body. I'm going to type in the word script. And this is just a script tag. That's where we're going to paste our JavaScript. You can format this, format with, beautify. Okay, make it look pretty. On the PowerPoint, we now just completed this second bullet. That says you'll need to add JavaScript for disabling form submissions if there are valid fields. I should say invalid fields. Invalid fields. That's right. That's right. It's not actually going to submit the form if there's invalid data. It says for custom Bootstrap form validation, you'll need to add the no validate Boolean attribute to your form. That looks just like this. Right here, no validate. Also, the class of needs validation on your form. So those are the two things that you're going to add to your form tag. A class of needs validation and the no validate attribute. So I'm going to go back here on my form. Class is one thing, and then no validate attribute. class was needs validation. I'm going to minimize this. Okay, all I'm going to have is a label for first name, input type of text. It's a form control large. Placeholder will be first name. Just put my name in placeholder. The attribute that we're going to add, and this was in the chapter, is the required. That marks first name as a required field. First name is a required field. And the button has to be a submit button. Button type of submit. Okay, it has to do the job of submitting the form. You can't have a button type of button or button type of reset. It has to be a submit button. So button type of submit. Okay, the button says whatever you want it to say. Submit me. Or just submit. Whatever. I'm going to repeat the steps I've taken. Step 1, a little bit of JavaScript that's required on the page for this to work. Step 2, add the class to the form, needs validation. And so what this does is basically tells the JavaScript to validate and not the HTML. This no validate attribute tells the HTML, don't validate it with HTML, validate it with JavaScript. That's what that does. These two things right here tell us to use JavaScript to validate it, not HTML. That's what that line does. This required attribute I put on the text box to say that this is a required field. You can't let the user leave it blank. Now, we're going to have 2 divs. One for valid feedback. One for invalid feedback. Invalid feedback will say, please provide your name. Good job. So you can kind of imagine what's going to happen. If they don't provide their name, it's going to give them this error message. Whereas if they do, it'll say, good job. Now see that it works. So here's my placeholder. If I click submit, there you get all of this Bootstrap. Let's talk about what it did. Number 1, it showed the content that says, that's on the invalid feedback, please provide your name. It also put this little warning symbol over here. Oh, you can't see it. There it is. It also added this little warning. If you inspect, that's a background image. See that right there? I can uncheck that background image. So it's a background image on our form control invalid state. So we talked about these, being, either valid states or invalid states. The border color of red was applied. Background image, you can see that. Background repeat, no repeat. See what happens if you repeat the image, right? All of this styling is coming from this class, the class of form control, which is right here, the class of form control with an invalid state. Right, so that's where that comes from. If I actually type in my name, you can see as I'm typing, now it's there, and it's kind of a very dynamic and interactive as the user's giving you good input. It turns green, gives me a check mark, and it says good job. Cross-browser, very interactive with the user. I like this validation a lot. It's the same pattern. Let's bring back our checkbox here. For radio buttons and checkboxes. For the sake of this example, I'm just looking at the clock. It's been 2 hours. I think this is a good just introductory example on how validation works in Bootstrap. We're 2 hours into the class though, so I'm going to kind of pause or stop the recording here and let you guys get into lab.